Good evening all, and welcome back. Tonight we have a story written by yours truly, entitled The Last Stop. It had been a good night. I really could not remember the last time that I had just, let loose. After everything that I had been through, it felt good to just be, to meet new people, to talk, to just be normal. The party had been good fun, and the few drinks that I had indulged in created a warmness within, despite the cold air that hung thick around me as I waited alone at the bus stop. Deborah had insisted on driving me home. She was good like that, but I did not want to be a burden. I knew that she had to clean up. I knew that she had to look after her son. And more importantly, I knew that she had things to do tomorrow morning. That, and she was clearly drunk when I had decided to leave. The dark, desolate country roads were no place for an inebriated driver, so I'd made my excuses, promised that I would phone her when I returned home, and then I had made my way to the bus stop alone. I smiled slightly as memories of the party filled my mind. In the distance, approaching headlights cut through the darkness of the night. Finally! The bus moved quickly towards me as I extended my arm, and after a few seconds, the driver signalled and pulled into the stop. I hurried on, eager to escape the cold, thanking the driver profusely as I took a seat at the back of the bus. Gradually, we pulled out and continued on down the empty, abandoned road. I was the only passenger, which was hardly surprising at this time of night. The small, quaint village that I had come to call home was populated with only about 200 people, most of them in their twilight years. They would already be asleep, and those who were not had more sense than to venture out at this hour, especially within this cold. Still though, I smiled, savouring the peacefulness of the journey. The party was worth it. Minutes passed as my mind wandered. Moving here had been good for me. The city and the inevitable darkness that it brought had slowly been grinding me down. This life was better, it was quieter, it was simpler. The anxiety I had felt, the terrible, crippling nastiness that had inhabited my mind within the city had slowly been abating, and I knew it was because of the change I had insisted upon my life. I had needed this, and I had needed this party. Things were finally starting to feel better. Things were finally making sense again. I smiled to myself once more as the bus began to slow, as it pulled into another stop. He was odd. I knew it the second that he stumbled onto the bus. There was just something about the young gentleman that was not quite right. I watched as he mumbled something to the driver, and I continued to watch with a strange caution as the door closed and he began to stumble towards me. In an instant, it was there. That familiar, nasty feeling. It coursed through me and it caused my heart to quicken. Within my previous life, it had been crippling, but here it felt different. Of course, the anxiety was a horrible sensation, a debilitating feeling which ensnared the mind, a unrelenting suffering that had caused so many dark years before, but here, as I watched the stranger approach, it was different. It was a warning.
Something is wrong.
Well, good evening, miss, he mumbled, half falling into the seat next to me. What a dreadful night to be alone. My heart began to strain as the unsettling sensation of disassociation started to build within me. Are you, alone, I mean? The heavy smell of alcohol clung to the stranger like a veil, a stifling stink that, despite my own consumption, seemed to cause my head to swim as a cold sweat slowly washed over my body.
Think quickly.
My mind was a haze. The man's features were not familiar, despite the intimate nature of the village. I had never seen him before. No, not at all. Not within the entire year that I had lived here, and the realization only further exacerbated the crippling feelings coursing throughout my veins. My head felt light as I forced a response. No, I lied. Well, not really. My boyfriend is meeting me when I get off. It moved so easily from my lips, but it did little to deter the man. He chuckled slightly as he began to slur once more. If you were mine, my girlfriend, I mean, there would be no way that I would let you out of my sights, especially not on a night like this, in this cold, in this snow. I mean, there's no telling who you might meet. My hand was shaking. I was unsure how long it had been shaking for. Carefully, I brought it into my other hand and attempted to steady the fear that had been growing exponentially within me. I knew that I could not let him see how afraid I was. I had to seem strong. With little coordination, he pulled a pouch of tobacco from his pocket and weakly began to roll a cigarette. So, what is your name, miss? Thoughts. Many, too many. They rattled within my mind, each half forming as I desperately attempted to formulate a plan. My stop was the last stop on the route, and if the stranger did not disembark before me, I would be left, alone, in the cold, with nobody for miles, apart from him. I forced a smile as another lie escaped my lips. My name's Judith. He smiled slightly as his fingers continued at the cigarette paper within his hand. Well, it's a real pleasure to meet you, Judith. The fact that he had not offered his own name barely registered. The only thought that existed within my mind was the stops on our route. We had just passed the penultimate one, meaning the only remaining one, the only one that was left, was mine, the last stop. He would be there. He would be there with me. He would be getting off at the same place. And it would only be him and I, standing on that dark road, completely alone.
Think. You've got to think.
Well, I'm new here, he slurred. I'm starting a fresh new job tomorrow. It's so nice to meet new people, especially people as pretty as you. By now, whatever pleasant feeling I had once felt had drained from my body. I had somehow managed to sober up, all within the space of a few minutes, aided by the adrenaline which pumped violently throughout my core. I knew that only a few fleeting minutes were left before I would have to leave the comfort and security of the bus and begin the 10-minute walk home alone. I had to come up with a plan. I had to get away. I thought about talking to the driver. I thought about phoning Deborah. I thought 1,000 thoughts, but none of them mattered. The anxiety had won. What little logic I once had escaped me. I had left reason somewhere back there, back in the cold, back at that bus stop where I had embarked. There was nothing left within me, nothing but the unrelenting desire to run. The stranger wobbled slightly in his seat as the bus took the last corner before the last stop. Wherever he had come from, he had clearly had a little too much fun. I wondered whether he could walk, whether he could run, or even if he could stand. If I had to run, I reasoned that I would be quicker than him. Maybe he would not be able to keep up. In slow motion, the bus jolted slightly and began to pull into the final stop. Before I knew it, I was moving. I moved to my feet and quickly moved down inside of the bus, preparing myself for a cold, quick dash home. It was not until I had reached the front door and the bus had pulled in that he realised that I had already left. He called to me as the door swung open, and then he called again as I leapt out into the frozen night air. "Going so soon?" His words were of no importance. As I stepped out into the darkness, my feet crunching loudly against the snow on the ground, the only thought within my mind was escaping. I had to get away. I had to get home. I had to be safe. I pushed, and then I pushed some more, willing my aching legs to carry me through the snow, through the quiet, empty streets, through the next 10 minutes, through the horror, and thankfully, when I briefly turned my head back, the bus had already left, and there was no sight of the man.
You're fine. Everything is fine.
After a few minutes, the anxious feelings within me began to subside.
He's gone.
I nervously allowed a laugh as I brought my hand up to my hair.
Everything is okay.
Gradually, I began to slow until my pace became more comfortable. The night around me, although a sharp cold, was actually quite beautiful. Below my steps was a sea of white, which offered a satisfying crunch as I continued my tread. The snow above that continued to fall looked picturesque as it drifted down past the streetlights, briefly illuminated in perfect fashion against the backdrop of light beaming perfectly from their bulbs. The air was fresh, and the solitude which had once felt threatening finally had been transformed. Now, all that was left within the world, all that was left within my path, within my life, and within my existence, all that was left was peace. However, peace was not a luxury that would linger, and tonight was no different. The question could not be ignored. It echoed through the night. It blanketed the snow, and it quilted the quiet road in an impossible fashion, insisting upon an answer even though I could barely comprehend one. "Where is your boyfriend?"
He's here.
Without a thought, without turning, and without hesitation, I began to run. Suddenly, the once peaceful night was filled with the shattering sound of two sets of feet hurriedly moving through the snow. Mine and his. The concerto of frenzied feet against snow reverberated loudly as my mind became unthinking. On instinct, my legs carried me, and without a thought, my body burned forward. My eyes began to haze as my sight became fuzzy, as the familiar sting of anxiety pulsed loudly. Somewhere within the back of my mind, I knew that he could not know where I lived. I do not know why I did it, but I did. Just before my home, my secluded home, my home that was flanked on all sides by fields, there was a turning. I knew of it as I enjoyed a walk in the evening, and last summer, when I had moved here, I had found the path. It snaked nicely through one of the fields behind of my house, before moving up a hill, through tall trees until finally emerging just a few feet from my home. Somewhere within the back of my mind, I must have reasoned that I'd be able to lose him within the shadow of the trees, that I would be able to evade him and then quietly creep into the safety of my home. That must have been the reason that I turned. It did not even occur to me that I was further secluding myself from life, that I was guiding him to a place so far from everything else where only he and I would exist. It was too late for second thoughts. I had already made the turning, and before I knew it, I was pushing my way up the hill towards the trees.
Oh my god, oh my god.
My limbs shook and my mind burned, but I kept pushing on, aided by the desire of survival, fueled by the need to continue. I could no longer feel my legs as they continued to carry me upward, and I could no longer hear the call behind of me, but it did not matter. I would not be stopping for anything. The resolve was there, but so too was the exhaustion. Although I had intended to keep going, although I meant to remain unstoppable, a misplaced step had other ideas. Below my feet, the snow had solidified somewhat, causing ice to form over the rarely walked path. It was perfectly placed, just waiting for me, anticipating a wrong move, and I, despite my intent, provided. Before I knew it, I was rolling with a speed down the hill towards the thick trees at the bottom. Although the ground was softer than usual due to the snow, and although my mind was unthinking, I still felt the twangs of intense pain as my body continued to move forcefully down. It was an eternity, and it was a forever, but at the same time, it was over in seconds. A large, looming tree at the bottom saw nicely to it. I smacked into the base of the tree, and instantly my body screamed in pain. My lips moved to scream and my eyes moved to tears, but the fear was more powerful. In a silent agony, I simply lay still within the bush that I had come to rest within, pleading with the night air, willing myself to breathe. And that is all that I done. For seconds, for minutes, for an immeasurable amount of time, I was nothing. I was a thing, something that had been forgotten so long ago, left outside, out within the cold and the snow. I was a rock. I was a stone. I was a disregarded memory, a piece of rubbish, no more than rubble. A shadow easily ignored within the darkness of the night. I was unmoving, I was unspeaking, and I was not there. At least, That is what I began to tell myself as the sound of approaching footsteps tore against the snow at the top of the hill. Where did you go, you pretty little thing? My limbs did not move. My chest barely rose with air. The only part of me I afforded a response were my eyes as they moved slowly up towards the top of the hill. Oh my God, there he is! I assumed that it was him. I could not be sure, as this time he was wearing a balaclava that concealed his features while exposing his intent. He carefully moved forward across the top of the hill before abruptly coming to a stop. You must want some company on this cold night. Do not move. The thought was there, and it continued. It repeated, and it moved over and over across the forefront of my mind as I willed myself to sink deeper into the snow. It was the only thing left within my life, and it guided me. It would keep me safe, and it would lead me towards another morning. It was all that I had left, and it was everything. Where are you? Why are you playing hard to get? A cold, frozen tear formed within my eye and gently moved down my face as I continued to watch silently on as he began to move again at the top of the hill. I will find you. Time was gone. It no longer existed. For years I remained there, a mess amongst the snow and the dirt. I lingered and I persisted, but I did not move, not even when his voice grew quieter, not even when the cold intensified, and not even when the morning sun gradually began to bless the sky above me. Somewhere within the distance, birds began their morning song. Somewhere out there, the world continued, and somewhere up the hill was my home. I allowed myself another hour, and then, when the cold became too much to bear, I slowly pulled myself from the bush, my body continuing to shiver from the cold and from the experience, and pathetically, I clawed my way up the hill and stumbled home. It was not until I was safely inside, not until I had locked my door, that I allowed myself to cry. It washed out from me, the sorrow, the fear, the anxiety, and the horror which I had been made to endure. Like a river, it was unrelenting. The waves of my sorrow crashing loudly as I howled, as I sobbed, as I fell apart, empty and broken upon my kitchen floor. I shook, I shivered, and I remained, allowing the horrific sensations to take me, just as I had learned to do with my anxiety. I knew that they would not last. I knew that I needed to let them go. After around 10 minutes, when I felt sufficiently empty, I rose to my feet and retrieved my phone, and I called the police. As my town was so small, I only got the answering machine. In the city, the police would be contactable 24 hours a day, but here, there was only a single officer entrusted to police our entire area. So, I left a message, one which I hoped to be coherent, and sank into my sofa. Quickly, sleep came. It had been there, probably for longer than I had realised, but it was only now that he had managed to permeate the layer between reality and my dreams. Still slightly shaking, I pulled myself from the sofa and made my way towards my front door. Carefully, I moved towards the door and paused just before opening it. Who is it? The response came, and so too did the instant ease. Miss, it's the police. I'm responding to the call that you made this morning.
Finally!
A smile grew across my lips as I unlatched the lock and threw open the door. After the events of last night, I would finally be safe. My whole life up until this point had been a struggle. The terrible anxiety which I had tried to escape from had somehow found me last night. It had followed me from the city, and it had found me right there on that bus, and it had followed me through the night, through the snow, up and down that hill, and it had followed me home. I had spent years trying to escape it, and last night it had almost caught up with me, but finally, now that help had arrived, I would finally be free. He smiled at me as the door opened, his uniform saying one thing while the weight of the fatigue under his eyes said another. He was clearly tired from the night prior, but the new job he had mentioned was clearly a responsibility that he could not ignore, despite spending the better part of last night chasing me through the snow. Well. Good morning, pretty. I told you that I would find you. Once again, that was The Last Stop, written by me. It marked the first video that I wrote the story, recorded the story, and produced the video on the same day. So yeah, you go me. I'm looking forward to doing more, and I hope that you enjoyed that story. And if you did, please consider liking, commenting, and potentially subscribing. But until the next video, remember, there is more than shadow beyond the light.